Our mission is clear. We will strike at dawn and take back what is ours.
June 19th, 194-408-30 a.m., Philippine Sea. The sky was already trembling with the roar of engines, the decks of Task Force 58 shuddering under the weight of steel. Heat shimmered off the carrier's surface, the acrid stench of fuel and gunpowder clung to every breath, and beneath the rising sun, nearly 1,000 American aircraft waited in silence. Somewhere beyond the horizon, an enemy was coming 400 planes, a tidal wave of red circles painted on fragile wings, convinced they could break the U.S. fleet. On the USS Independence, Lieutenant Commander David Harrington tightened the straps of his flight harness. His palms brushed against the armored frame of his F-6F Hellcat, a machine born from fire and failure, forged to answer the myth of the Zero. 3 years earlier, the same horizon had belonged to Japan. Its fighters carved terror into Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Coral Sea. Now, Harrington stood on the edge of a different dawn, the hum of his Pratt & Whitney engine beneath him, like a caged animal begging to be unleashed. It was a paradox no one had expected. The hunters of 1,941 had become the hunted of 1,944. Japanese pilots, once the elite predators of the Pacific, were now boys with barely 50 hours in the cockpit. Opposite them stood men tempered by years of defeat and survival, armed with a weapon designed not just to fight but to endure. The decks rattled as the signal came. Fighters locked into catapults. The war that had begun in surprise and humiliation was about to turn in fire and annihilation. And in the next few hours, the Pacific sky would decide which empire still had wings. June 19th, 1,944 Philippine Sea. The opening signal had not yet sounded, but the ocean itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. On the flight deck of the USS Independence, the morning air was heavy with the scent of salt aviation fuel and the iron tang of heated steel. The deck crews moved with clockwork precision, their faces smeared with grease and sweat, their voices carried away in the roar of idling engines. Beneath the sun climbing slowly over the Pacific, the carriers of Task Force 58 stood like floating fortresses, their decks crowded with blue-painted fighters, wings folded like the claws of waiting predators. Every clang of steel boots on metal grating echoed like a countdown. Lieutenant Commander David Harrington stood beside his Hellcat tail number 29, a silhouette against the faint orange of dawn. His gloves brushed the riveted skin of the fuselage, feeling the pulse of the beast he was about to unleash. Around him, mechanics wrestled with ammunition belts as thick as a man's wrist, feeding 650 caliber guns with the promise of destruction. Harrington inhaled deeply the fumes of gasoline burning his throat and let it out slow. The smell was sharp, poisonous, but strangely comforting. To him, it meant readiness. It meant survival. His wingman, Lieutenant Samuel Ortiz, younger, nervous, but steady-eyed, leaned against his own Hellcat, a grin flickering across his face as though to mask the storm in his chest. Across the carrier group, the scene repeated itself. Squadrons of young men, barely more than boys, strapped themselves into cockpits that would decide the day. Flight crews worked feverishly, bolts tightened canopies, sealed bombs slung beneath fuselages. In the combat information centers, radar screens flickered with ghostly blips that hinted at what was already rising over the western horizon. The calm of the sea was a lie, a cruel illusion stretched thin over the storm about to break. Captain Walter Green, commander of Air Group 22, walked the deck with the weight of 2 wars etched across his face. A veteran of Midway, he carried the memory of friends burned alive in Wildcats that had never stood a chance against the Zero. His voice was gravel when he addressed the men, but his eyes, sharp and unyielding, cut through the haze. "Today is the reckoning," he said, pointing at the tactical chart. "They will come in force. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. They believe the Zero still rules the sky. You will prove them wrong. You are the shield. You are the line." His words landed heavy, not as rhetoric, but as truth, the kind that settled in the bones of every man who listened. For the Japanese, it was faith that carried them across the sea. faith in the legend of the Zero, the sleek white ghost that had once danced through the skies above Pearl Harbor and left American pilots helpless. That myth still lingered in their command rooms, whispered like a prayer, the Zero cannot be beaten. But aboard the Independence, Harrington and his men had another answer. The Hellcat, massive armored snarling with horsepower, was not built to dance. It was built to kill, to absorb punishment, to claw its way through fire and come out the other side. Against the fragile wings of the Zero, it was a hammer waiting for glass. The contrast was stark. Japan had scraped together 9 carriers, hundreds of aircraft and pilots as young as 17, many with barely 50 hours in the cockpit. America answered with 15 carriers, nearly 1,000 aircraft, and pilots who had drilled for months. Some for years, their training hours counted not in dozens, but in hundreds. The war had shifted, and this morning would prove it. Harrington could feel it deep in his chest. The balance was no longer fragile. It had tipped, and it would break. The engines began to roar, one after another, the growl of Pratt & Whitney machines swelling into a thunder that rolled across the sea. Harrington pulled his helmet over his head, the world shrinking to the scent of sweat, rubber, and oil. He caught Ortiz's eye one last time and gave a sharp nod. Ortiz's grin widened fierce, now alive with the fire of youth. Around them, men tightened their harnesses, checked their gauges, hands trembling not from fear but from the adrenaline surging through their veins. On the bridge of the flagship USS Lexington, Admiral Mark Mitcher stood tall, his face carved from stone, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Calm, deliberate, his voice carried through the radio net. Launch the combat air patrol. Hold the line. Do not let them through. The words struck like a spark in a powder keg. Harrington climbed into his Hellcat canopy, sliding shut with a metallic snap. Inside the cockpit, the world narrowed to instruments, glowing faintly green to the vibrations of the 2,000 horsepower engine under his feet, to the weight of the machine guns waiting at his command. The deck beneath him shook as the catapult slammed fighters into the sky, one by one, blue giants leaping from steel into endless air. His turn was coming. Ortiz's voice crackled over the radio, forced lightness masking the tension. "Skipper, you think they'll come all at once?" Harrington's reply was steady, clipped. "If they're smart. But smart doesn't win wars anymore. Mass does." He glanced over the canopy edge, watching wave after wave of Hellcats climb their engines, howling like beasts finally unleashed. And still, the tension built. Every man on that deck knew what was coming. Radar reports were growing clearer, multiple bogeys, dozens, then scores, then hundreds. 400 aircraft bearing down on Task Force 58, the largest aerial strike the Pacific had ever seen. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese pilots tightened their scarves, muttered quiet prayers, and believed they were flying to glory. Harrington knew better. He had flown against the Zero when it was a phantom. He had seen friends die, screaming in cockpits that could not keep up. But this was no longer 1,942. This was no longer desperation. This was retribution. He flexed his gloved hands on the stick, felt the weight of destiny pressing against his chest. This morning was not about survival. It was about supremacy. The signal officer raised his hand, the deck crew bracing as the next fighter rolled into place. Harrington pushed the throttle forward, the Hellcat snarling eager. The moment stretched, heavy electric. And as the catapult hurled him into the sky, he felt the Pacific open wide before him, a stage set for reckoning. But to understand why this dawn mattered, why these men carried certainty, where once there had been fear, you must look back to the days when the Zero ruled without rival, when America's answer had yet to be born, when survival meant nothing more than diving and praying. To understand June 19th, you must first understand the years of blood that forged it. The roar of Harrington's Hellcat leaving the deck faded into the wide Pacific sky. But to grasp why he flew with such certainty that morning, one had to turn back to the years when certainty was impossible, when every American pilot who, strapped into a cockpit, knew the odds were against him. In 1941 and 1942, the Japanese Zero was not just a fighter plane, it was a ghost. Sleek, impossibly agile it seemed, to defy the laws of air combat. It could outclimb, outturn, and outrun anything America put into the sky. The Zero arrived like a storm over Pearl Harbor, its guns tearing through the morning air, its bombs sinking battleships in minutes. The image of that aircraft seared itself into the American imagination, a machine of death that no amount of courage could touch. For men like Harrington, the early war years were a nightmare written in fire. He remembered climbing into the stubby little Wildcat, the best America could field at the time, and feeling as though he was flying with lead weights tied to his wings. The Wildcat was sturdy, yes, able to take punishment, but it was slow, underpowered, and hopelessly outclassed. Every encounter with a Zero felt like a death sentence. The Japanese fighter turned tighter, climbed faster, dove away with ease. If a Wildcat pilot tried to follow, he was already dead. The only chance was to dive fire a burst and pray to escape before the Zero slid onto his tail. In those days, pilots were chewed up in weeks. Green recruits, barely out of flight, school were thrown into the sky against masters who had trained for years, and the losses mounted with brutal speed. At Wake Island, the Zero carved American planes from the sky like paper. In the Philippines, it struck without mercy. Over the Coral Sea, it was everywhere, twisting through formations, leaving smoking wrecks in its wake. For the young men sent to fight it, there was a growing realization: courage alone was not enough. They were bringing knives to a gunfight, and the enemy knew it. The desperation bled into every mission. Harrington recalled the helplessness of watching his wingman vanish in a burst of flame, the canopy shattering smoke filling the cockpit, the Wildcat spinning into the sea. He remembered the smell of burning oil, the sight of parachutes, failing to open the silence on the radio after a frantic shout. There was nothing more terrifying than knowing that even if you flew your machine perfectly, the Zero could still dance circles around you. It wasn't just fighting a plane, it was fighting a legend. But legends can be broken. In the crucible of those early defeats, America learned. Every pilot who survived sent back reports. Every weakness of the Zero was studied, dissected, written down. They discovered its paper-thin skin, its lack of armor, its fragile fuel tanks. The Zero was a predator, but a fragile one. If only America could field a fighter that could absorb hits, that could strike hard and keep flying, the tide might turn. Out of that desperate need, engineers at Grumman Aircraft went to work. By mid-1994, two blueprints emerged for something entirely different. Forget chasing the Zero's agility. Forget matching its featherweight frame. America would not build a dancer. America would build a brawler. And so the F-6F Hellcat was born. The Hellcat was a monster compared to the Wildcat. Larger, heavier, but powerful, driven by a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine that could drag it skyward like a hawk. Its cockpit was wrapped in armor, its fuel tanks, self-sealing, 6 .50 caliber machine guns stretched across its wings, each capable of spitting molten death in thick streams of tracers. Where the Zero was delicate, the Hellcat was brutal. Where the Zero avoided hits by twisting away, the Hellcat absorbed punishment and kept climbing. It was not subtle, it was survival on wings. When the first Hellcats reached the fleet in late 1943, the effect was immediate. Pilots who had cut their teeth in Wildcats strapped into the new machines and felt the difference instantly. Harrington remembered his first flight, the way the engine pulled, without hesitation, the way the climb rate surged, the way the guns roared in perfect unison. For the first time, he felt the odds even out. No longer did he have to dive and pray. Now he could meet the Zero head-on and live to tell the tale. But the true power of the Hellcat wasn't just in steel and horsepower. Behind it loomed the relentless machine of American industry. While Japan struggled to replace a few dozen aircraft each month, America rolled thousands from its factories. While Japanese flight schools cut training hours to scraps, American cadets logged hundreds of hours before they ever saw combat. The math was cold and merciless. Japan's pilots were dwindling, their training shallow, their machines fragile. America's pilots were multiplying, trained, armed, and riding into battle on the wings of a weapon designed to win. The shift was undeniable. By 1944, the Zero was no longer the hunter. It was the hunted, and every pilot in Task Force 58 knew it. Harrington could feel the difference in his bones. Where once the Zero had haunted his nightmares, now the Hellcat lived in his hands, a beast eager for blood. This was the paradox that hung over the Philippine Sea that morning. The Japanese still believed in their phantom, still clung to the legend of invincibility. They flew with duty and desperation, convinced that sheer courage would carry them to victory. But courage could not rebuild burned-out factories. Courage could not conjure veteran pilots out of boys barely trained. Courage could not stop the roar of 900 Hellcats rising from American decks. Harrington tightened his straps and glanced at Ortiz beside him, knowing full well what their machines represented. The Hellcat was not just an airplane. It was the end of an era. It was the embodiment of every lesson paid for, in blood, every funeral, every wreck sunk beneath Pacific waves. It was the promise that Pearl Harbor would not happen again. And in just minutes, that promise would be tested. Because the horizon was darkening with the largest strike Japan had ever launched. 400 aircraft were coming, red suns painted on their wings, their pilots flying into history. And the Hellcat born from fire and forged in defeat was waiting. And that was why June 19th was no ordinary day. It was the day America's answer would prove itself, in combat the day the Zero's reign would be challenged head-on. And it was the day when the weapon born of desperation would finally meet its trial by fire. And that weapon, the Hellcat, was about to write its legend in the skies above the Marianas. The Hellcat was waiting, and the moment it had been forged for arrived without mercy. At 0830 on June 19th, radar screens aboard Task Force 58 lit up with swarms of enemy blips surging in from the west. The numbers climbed higher, the reports sharper, 100, then 200, then 400 aircraft. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters rose in waves like a black tide stretching across the horizon. It was the greatest aerial strike the Pacific had yet seen, and it was flying straight for the American fleet. The first wave appeared as specks in the morning haze, the sun glinting off wings marked with crimson circles. They grew quickly into shapes, then into a wall of planes bearing down with deadly intent. In his Hellcat, Harrington tightened his grip on the stick, his heart hammering in rhythm with the engine's growl. Above the roar of wind, the radio crackled with Commander Dalton's calm voice. Contact. All flights engage. Remember your training. Boom and zoom. Do not turn with them. Strike hard. Climb away. Harrington nosed down the world, blurring as the Hellcat dove like a hawk. Wind screamed across the canopy, speed climbing past 350 knots. Below a zero cut across the formation oblivious, Harrington squeezed the trigger. 6 streams of fire tore into the enemy, the fragile fighter exploding into a ball of flame before the pilot even had time to react. Splash 1, he called, pulling hard into a climb. Ortiz's voice followed wild with adrenaline. Got a Judy. She's burning. Explosions dotted the sky as the Hellcats tore through the formation. The first wave collapsed in chaos. Dive bombers plummeted in flames, torpedo planes shredded before they could align their runs. Fewer than 10 reached the fleet, and every one of them was blasted from the air by American gunners. By 1000, the ocean below was littered with burning wreckage and oil slicks, the first Japanese assault annihilated. But there was no time to breathe. At 1030, radar reported another storm inbound over 120 aircraft, another wave of torpedo planes and fighters clawing toward the fleet. Harrington checked his fuel and ammunition still strong. Dalton's voice cut through again. All units intercept. Hold the line. The second wave came fast, the horizon black, with specks that swelled into wings and propellers. Ortiz's laugh crackled over the radio, masking the tension. That's a whole damn Air Force. Harrington's answer was steel. Then let's bury it. The Hellcats dove again, slicing into the Japanese formation with savage precision. Zeros scattered in panic green pilots, breaking formation, their discipline crumbling under the assault. Veterans tried to rally them, but the blue fighters smashed through with relentless fury. Harrington locked onto a Val dive bomber carrying a heavy load beneath its fuselage. A short burst ignited its engine. Flames engulfed the plane, detonating its bomb midair, the fireball scattering across the formation. Ortiz shouted through the static, "Another Judy down, she's gone." But danger came fast. A Zero slid onto Harrington's tail tracers, ripping across his wing. The Hellcat shuddered, metal tearing. He dove hard, the enemy clinging close. At 5000 feet, he yanked back into a climbing turn, the Pratt & Whitney engine screaming. The Zero tried to follow, but stalled its fragile frame, straining beyond its limits. Harrington rolled inverted, came down like a hammer, and shredded it with a burst. Splash another, he breathed sweat, soaking his gloves. Everywhere, fire bloomed. Torpedo planes lumbered toward the fleet at barely 200 miles an hour, only to be torn apart. Captain Walter Green personally destroyed 2 in a single pass, his division cutting through the bombers like wolves among sheep. The second wave fell apart, just as the first had, leaving only smoking trails and falling wings. By 1130, the Pacific sky was littered with wreckage, parachutes drifting down to seas, already slick with burning fuel. And still they came. Just past noon, radar screens lit again. Another 80 Japanese aircraft rose from the horizon, a third wave clawing desperately toward the fleet. But these pilots were younger, still boys barely out of training, some so inexperienced, they struggled to hold formation. Harrington dove on a Judy bomber, riddling its engine until it exploded in a fireball. Ortiz tore through a Zero with a clean burst, laughing hoarsely through the radio. They're falling like flies. The Americans rotated squadrons, seamlessly fresh, Hellcats taking the place of those low on fuel and ammunition. It was relentless, disciplined mechanical. The Japanese tried to form a shield, tried to hold together, but the sky itself betrayed them. Their lines broke, their courage faltered, and one by one they fell into the sea. The radio was alive with voices. Splash 1, got another Val, he's smoking, going down. The sky above the fleet was a cauldron of smoke and fire wreckage, spiraling down like burning confetti. The third wave disintegrated under the assault the Pacific, once again turning into a graveyard of twisted metal. At 1315, the final strike appeared 50 aircraft, but these were not elite squadrons. They were scraps, obsolete machines, training planes pressed into service, desperate to do what their comrades could not. Dalton's voice carried the weight of finality. Gentlemen, finish it. The Hellcats rose one last time, tearing into the clumsy attackers with ruthless efficiency. Twin-engine bombers lumbered forward only to be shredded in seconds, burning wrecks tumbling into the waves. The fourth wave barely reached within sight of the American fleet before it was erased from the sky. Then silence. Harrington leveled out at 12,000 feet, scanning the horizon. The crowded sky that had boiled with enemy planes was now empty. No more swarms, no more black columns of smoke clawing upward. Only wreckage, only oil slicks, only parachutes drifting helplessly down. Ortiz's voice came through quieter now. "Skipper, how many do you think we got?" Harrington exhaled slowly. "Too many to count." Below them, the Pacific stretched wide, littered with burning fuel and broken wings, the sea itself a graveyard of empire. 4 waves had come. 4 waves had fallen. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft lay scattered across the ocean, consumed in fire and salt. American losses were fewer than 30. The myth of the Zero, once untouchable, had been broken, its wings ripped away by the very machine designed to destroy it. And as Harrington guided his Hellcat back toward the fleet, the truth was undeniable. This was not just victory. This was annihilation. When the smoke cleared, the Pacific sky no longer belonged to Japan. It belonged to the Hellcat. And when the fire finally faded, the legend of the Zero was gone forever. When the smoke settled, the sky was no longer theirs. It was American sky now, and from this day forward, nothing would ever be the same. Because when the battle ended, when the echoes of gunfire died, the Pacific itself declared Japan's reign in the air was finished. When the fire and smoke lifted, the sky no longer belonged to Japan. It was American sky now. And the Zero was finished. When the flames died, the sky had been decided. The reign of the Zero ended in smoke and silence. And when the smoke cleared, the Pacific was no longer Japanese. It belonged to the Hellcat. The sky was quiet now, but it was not peace, it was aftermath. The fire and smoke of the 4 waves still drifted in ghostly ribbons across the horizon, the wreckage of hundreds of Japanese aircraft bobbing in the oily swells below. For Harrington, the silence after the storm was almost deafening. Only hours earlier, the sky had been alive with chaos, tracer fire slashing across the clouds, engines howling, pilots screaming into radios as death rained from above. Now it was empty, still haunted. What remained was the tally, and the tally was brutal. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed in a single day. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, Zeros, all scattered across the Philippine Sea in twisted pieces of steel and burning fuel. The proud naval air arm that had once terrorized the Pacific was gone. The veterans who had carried Japan's empire from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea had been ripped from the sky. Many never made it back to their carriers. Others floated in the waves, clinging to wreckage as the sun sank westward, their survival as hopeless as their mission had been. By contrast, American losses were shockingly light, fewer than 30 aircraft. Many of those pilots recovered alive from the sea. The kill ratio was staggering, more than 14-1. It was not a battle, it was annihilation. For every American fighter that fell, entire squadrons of Japanese planes were wiped away. The figures that evening stunned even the men who had flown through it. They had known victory was possible. Few had expected it to be so absolute. For Task Force 58, the immediate result was undeniable. Their carriers stood untouched. Their battleships, cruisers, and destroyers sailed unscathed. Not a single torpedo or bomb had broken through the defensive shield of Hellcats and anti-aircraft fire. Admiral Mitcher's gamble had paid off in full. He had trusted in his fighters and the strength of American industry and the training of his pilots, and the result was devastating proof. Japan had thrown its best, its last true gamble in the air, and it had shattered on impact. The implications stretched far beyond the numbers. Japan's naval aviation was not merely weakened, it was destroyed as an effective fighting force. In one day, the empire had lost what it could never replace, its cadre of experienced pilots. The men who had trained for years, who had mastered the Zero's deadly dance, were gone. In their place, Japan could only send boys half-trained trembling in cockpits. They barely understood flying machines that were already obsolete. Factories could build more planes, yes, but factories could not forge. Experience could not conjure veterans out of children, and America knew it. The carriers of Ozawa's fleet retreated into the night, their decks half empty, their hangars echoing with silence, where once aircraft had been lined wingtip to wingtip. The Japanese command understood at once what had been lost. Without their air arm, their carriers were nothing but floating targets, vulnerable, naked in seas dominated by the Hellcat. The mighty spearhead of Japan's naval power, the very weapon that had thrust across the Pacific in 1941, was broken. On the decks of Task Force 58, the mood was surreal. Pilots stumbled from their cockpits, their hands still trembling, uniforms streaked with sweat and powder. Some grinned, unable to contain the relief of survival. Others sat silently staring into the horizon, the images of falling planes and burning pilots etched into their minds. Ortiz dropped his helmet on the deck, shaking his head in disbelief. "Skipper," he muttered to Harrington, "I lost count. I can't even guess how many went down today." Harrington looked back at the sky, still marked by thin trails of smoke curling into the heavens. "Neither can I," he said quietly, "but I know what it means." What it meant was clear. Japan could no longer defend its fleets. From this day forward, American carriers could sail where they pleased, strike when they wished unchallenged by the once feared Zero. The Marianas would fall. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam would become springboards for the bombers that would pound Japan's cities. The Pacific balance had shifted permanently. The age of the Zero was over. The era of the Hellcat had begun. The sheer disparity was as symbolic as it was strategic. Once in 1941, America had been caught, sleeping humiliated at Pearl Harbor, its ships burning while Japanese aircraft ruled overhead. Now in 1944, it was Japan's turn to taste helplessness, to watch its proud fleet stripped of its wings in a single day. The hunter had become the hunted, and the hunted had been destroyed. But for Harrington, for Green, for Dalton, for Ortiz, the victory was sharp but not sweet. They knew what those numbers meant in human terms. The men they had fought were not monsters, but pilots like themselves, young and frightened, driven by duty into hopeless odds. He could still see their parachutes drifting down into the sea, still hear the crack of guns that silenced their engines. The battlefield belonged to the Hellcat, yes, but the ocean was filled with boys who had never stood a chance. Yet war is merciless, and its lessons even more so. America had proven what Japan refused to accept, that war was no longer about the brilliance of a few aces or the legend of a single machine. It was about systems, about industry, about training and numbers and machines that could be built faster than the enemy could destroy them. Japan had clung to the myth of the Zero. America had built the Hellcat, and behind it an industrial juggernaut that no myth could stop. When the official reports were filed that night, the numbers told the story in stark black and white. Nearly 395 Japanese aircraft destroyed, American losses only 29. A kill ratio unmatched in the history of aerial warfare. It was not just a turning point. It was the breaking point. Japan's naval air arm, once the terror of the Pacific, ceased to exist. As a fighting force on June 19, 1944. But numbers are only the surface. What mattered more was the meaning behind them, the shift that no statistic could fully capture. Because in truth, Japan had lost far more than planes. It had lost the ability to protect its empire. It had lost its shield. And from that day forward, every island, every stronghold, every city lay open to the steel wings of American power. But the statistics, as grim as they were only the beginning. The real weight of June 19th lay not in the numbers themselves, but in what they foretold. Because the wreckage floating on the Philippine Sea was not just the end of a battle, it was the end of an era. And the true consequences, the ones that would echo through the rest of the war, were still to come. Because the numbers, devastating as they were only the surface. The deeper meaning, the one that would define the Pacific War, was just beginning to unfold. And that was the truth waiting in the silence after the fire. Because numbers were the surface. The real story was the future they unlocked. But those numbers were only the beginning. The true importance lay in what came next. And that truth was this: Japan's air power was gone, and the Pacific would never belong to them again. But the statistics were only the surface. The real meaning, the long shadow of this day, was far more than numbers could tell. The numbers told one story, but the meaning told another. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft destroyed, only 29 American planes lost, a kill ratio that defied belief. But as the smoke cleared over the Philippine Sea, the true legacy of June 19, 1944 was not written in statistics. It was written in fire, in silence, in the shift of power that no one could deny. The Zero, once the phantom of the Pacific, died that day. For 3 years it had ruled the skies, a machine so agile, so lethal that it seemed untouchable. American pilots had cursed it, feared it, respected it as a predator beyond their reach. But now the myth lay shattered in the waves. Burned wreckage floated where once its shadow had terrorized fleets. The Zero's legend, built on surprise and speed, could not withstand the brute force of the Hellcat. What had begun at Pearl Harbor ended here in the Marianas under the guns of a fighter designed from the blood of those first defeats. And so a new era began, the era of the Hellcat. Heavy, powerful, forgiving, deadly in the hands of rookies and veterans alike. It was the ultimate expression of what America had become. Not just a nation fighting back, but a machine of war that learned, adapted, and overwhelmed. Every rivet of the Hellcat carried the lessons of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway. It was more than an airplane. It was a declaration that America had turned the tide, and from now on the sky belonged to them. The implications reached far beyond one battle. With Japan's naval air arm destroyed, the seas lay open. The Marianas would fall, Saipan, Tinian, Guam becoming springboards for the B-29 superfortresses that would rain fire on Tokyo itself. The road stretched forward to Iwo Jima and Okinawa battles, where American carriers sailed without fear of massed enemy air attacks. The shield that had once guarded Japan's empire was gone, ripped away in a single day of slaughter. And from that moment on, America's carriers moved as they wished, striking with impunity, projecting a dominance that no force could contest. But the true lesson of the great Marianas Turkey Shoot was larger still. It proved that war in the modern age was not won by a few brilliant aces or by a single miraculous machine. It was won by systems, by the relentless power of industry, by the discipline of training, by the organization of entire nations harnessed to the fight. Japan had gambled on courage, on the myth of invincibility, on boys, barely out of school, flying into hopeless odds. America had gambled on production lines, on instructors drilling cadets for hundreds of hours, on engineers turning combat reports into steel and fire. And in the end, systems triumphed over myth. For Harrington and the men who fought that day, the victory was tangible but heavy. They had survived where so many had not. They had proven themselves and their machines, but they could not escape the truth that their enemies had been boys too flung into the air by commanders who refused to accept reality. The Hellcat had destroyed the Zero, but behind every kill was a human life lost to desperation. Victory had been absolute, but it was not without its shadow. Still, the significance could not be denied. From that day forward, America commanded the Pacific skies. Every carrier deck bristled with Hellcats, their folded wings lined like silent guardians. Every mission flew under their protection, every invasion shielded by their dominance. The Zero no longer haunted American pilots. It was history now, a relic of a time when the outcome of the war was uncertain. In its place rose the Hellcat, symbol of supremacy, symbol of a nation that had refused to break. By the war's end, the Hellcat would account for more than 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, its kill ratio, an unmatched 19-1. But numbers again only told part of the story. Its real legacy was in what it represented: adaptation, resilience, and the sheer weight of a system that could not be stopped. The Hellcat was proof that the lessons of Pearl Harbor had been learned, that America had taken its wounds and turned them into weapons, that the sacrifices of 1,941 and 1,942 had not been in vain. And so when Tokyo Bay finally filled with American warships in 1945, when the Japanese delegation signed surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri, Hellcats circled overhead as silent witnesses, the Zero was gone. Its reign, its legend, its terror all ended. The Hellcat remained guardian of the moment that closed the war it had helped decide. This was the meaning of June 19th. 1944. Not just victory, not just destruction, but transformation. The end of one era and the beginning of another. The Pacific was no longer contested. It belonged to the carriers, and the carriers belonged to the Hellcat. But perhaps the greatest truth was, this war had moved beyond the courage of the few. It was now about nations that could outbuild, outtrain, and outlast their enemies. Japan had no answer to that. America did. And that is why the Marianas mattered. It was not only the day the Zero died. It was the day America claimed the sky. When the fire faded, when the wreckage sank, when the Pacific fell silent, the meaning endured. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was more than a battle. It was a warning, a revelation, a shift that would echo for generations. And it is only one chapter. There are more battles, more machines, more forgotten voices waiting in the shadows of history. The past is not silent. It still speaks. And we will tell its story. June 19th, 1944 was more than a victory. It was the fracture point of the Pacific War. In one day, the Zero's legend burned away, and the Hellcat rose as the symbol of a new order. Japan lost not just planes but the shield of its empire, and America gained more than dominance, it gained inevitability. From Saipan to Okinawa, every strike that followed carried the echo of this battle. The Marianas Turkey Shoot was the end of an era and the dawn of another proof that myth cannot stand against steel training and a nation unwilling to fall.